He glanced across the tarmac as a refueling truck rumbled past. In the distance, 2 men in fluorescent jackets were standing talking in front of a hangar. Otherwise, he seemed to be alone. Ahead of him, a sign read, "Welcome to London City Airport," and beneath it, an open door beckoned, leading to immigration. He headed for it, unaware that he was being watched every step of the way. The man was in his 50s, bald and expressionless. Inside the terminal, he gave his passport to the official and watched with blank eyes as it was examined and handed back, then continued on his way. He had no luggage. There was a black limousine waiting for him outside with a grey-suited chauffeur behind the wheel. The man offered no greeting as he got in, nor did he speak as they set off, following the curve of the River Thames up towards Canning Town and on towards the centre of London itself. His name was Zeljan Kirst, and he was wanted by the police in 17 different countries. He was the chief executive of the international criminal organisation known as Scorpia, and, as far as it was known, he had never been seen on the streets of London. However, MI6 had been tipped off that he was coming, and they had been waiting for him to land. The passport official was one of their secret agents. They were following him now.
Heading west on the A13 commercial road towards Whitechapel. Car 3 take over at the next intersection. Car 3 moving into position. OK, dropping back.
The disembodied voices bounced across the airwaves on a channel so secret that anyone trying to tune in without the necessary filters would hear only the hiss of static. It would have been easier to arrest Kirst at the airport. He could have been made to disappear in 5 seconds, bundled out in a crate and never seen again. But it had been decided, at the very highest level, to follow him and see where he went. For the head of Scorpia to be in England at all was remarkable. For him to be on his own, and on his way to a meeting, was beyond belief. Zeljan Kirst was not aware that he was surrounded. He had no idea that his flight plan had been leaked by one of his own people in return for a complete change of identity and a new life in Panama. But even so, he was uneasy. Everything had told him that he shouldn't be here. When the invitation had first arrived on his desk, delivered by a series of middlemen and travelling halfway round the world and back again, he had thought about refusing. He was not an errand boy. He couldn't be summoned like a waiter in a restaurant. But then he had reconsidered. When the 4th richest man in the world asks you to meet him, and pays you €1 million just to turn up, it might be as well to hear what he has to say.
We're on High Holborn, car 4 moving to intercept. Wait a minute, he's turning off.
The limousine had crossed the main road and entered a narrow street full of old-fashioned shops and cafes. The move had taken the MI6 men by surprise, and for a moment there was panic as they struggled to catch up. 2 of their cars swerved across the traffic to a blast of horns and plunged in after it. They were just in time to see the limousine stop and Zeljan Kirst get out.
Car 4, where are you?
The voice was suddenly urgent.
Where is the target?
A pause, then...
He's entering the British Museum.
It was true. Kirst had passed through the gates and was crossing the open area in front of the famous building which rose up ahead of him, its huge pillars stretching from one side to the other. He was carrying an ebony walking stick that measured out his progress, rapping against the concrete. The MI6 men were already piling out of their cars, but they were too late. Even as they watched from the other side of the gates, Kirst disappeared into the building, and they knew that if they didn't act swiftly, they would lose him for good. There was more than one way out. It was unlikely that the Scorpia man would have travelled all the way to England just to look at an exhibit. He might have gone inside deliberately to shake them off.
He's inside the museum. Cars 1, 2 and 3 surround the building. Watch all possible exits. We need immediate backup.
Someone had taken charge, but whoever it was, his voice sounded high-pitched and uncertain. It was 11 o'clock on a bright February morning. The museum would be crowded with tourists and schoolchildren. If there was going to be any action, if they were going to arrest Zeljan Kirst, this was the last place they would want to do it. In fact, Kirst was still unaware of his pursuers as he crossed the great court, a gleaming white space with a spectacular glass roof sweeping in a huge curve overhead. He skirted round the gift shops and information booths, making for the first galleries. As he went, He noticed a Japanese couple, tiny and almost identical, taking photographs of each other against a twisting staircase. A bearded student with a backpack was looking at the postcards, pulling them out one at a time, and studying them as if trying to find hidden codes. Tap, tap, tap. The end of the walking stick beat out its rhythm as Kirst continued on his way. He knew exactly where he was going, and would arrive at the precise minute that had been agreed. Zelschen Kirst was a large man with heavy, broad shoulders that formed a straight line on either side of an unnaturally thick neck. He was bald by choice. His head had been shaved, and there was a dark grey shadow beneath the skin. His eyes, a muddy brown, showed little intelligence, and he had the thick lips and small, squashed nose of a wrestler, or perhaps a bouncer at a shady nightclub. Many people had underestimated him, and occasionally Kirst had found it necessary to correct them. This usually involved killing them. He walked past the statue of a crouching naked goddess. An elderly woman in a deerstalker hat, sitting on a stool with brushes and oil paints, was making a bad copy of it on a large white canvas. Ahead of him were two stone animals, strangely shaped lions, and to one side an entire temple, more than 2,000 years old, brought from southwest Turkey and reconstructed piece by piece. He barely glanced at them. He didn't like museums, although his house was furnished with rare objects that had been stolen from several of them. But that was the point. Why should something that might be worth hundreds of thousands of pounds be left to moulder in a dark room, stared at by idiot members of the general public who had little or no idea of its true value? Kirst had a simple rule in life. To enjoy something fully, you had to own it, and if you couldn't buy it, then you would have to steal it. Ahead of him, two glass doors led into a final gallery. He watched as a tall, well-built black man carrying a notebook and pen walked through, then went in himself. The gallery was huge, stretching out in both directions like an airport runway. Although more than 100 people were there, it wasn't even half full. Everything was grey, the walls, the floor, the very air, but spotlights shining down from a ceiling 5 times higher than the visitors who stood beneath it picked out the treasures that the room contained, and these shone, soft and gold. They ran along both walls, from one end to the other, a series of marble tablets with a crowd of figures that had been brought together to form a single line. They were men and women, ancient Greeks, some sitting, others standing, some talking, some riding on horseback. Some carried musical instruments, others bundles of linen, or plates and glasses for a feast. Many were incomplete. 2.5 millennia had worn away their faces, broken off arms and legs. But there was something remarkable about the details that remained. It was easy to see that these had been real people who had once lived ordinary lives until they had been frozen in this waking dream, an entire world captured in stone. Zelschen Kirst barely glanced at them. The gallery had 2 raised platforms, one at each end, reached by a short flight of steps with a disabled lift, which must have been used by the man he had come to see. There he was, in a wheelchair, on the far right, sitting alone, with a blanket over his knees. Kirst walked over to him. "Mr. Kirst." The voice was dry and strangled. It came from a lizard neck. Kirst nodded. He was a careful man and made it a rule never to speak unless there was a particular need. "I am Ariston." "I know who you are. Thank you for coming." Yanis Ariston Xenopoulos was said to be worth about $35 billion, nearly £25 billion. He had made this fortune from a huge shipping empire which he controlled from his offices in Athens. To this he had added an airline, Ariston Air, and a chain of hotels. And now he was dying. Kirst would have known it even without reading the stories in the newspapers. It was obvious from the sunken cheeks, the dreadful white of the man's skin, the way he sat like a hunched-up Egyptian mummy, his body disappearing into itself. But most of all it was in his eyes. Kirst had once been the head of the Yugoslavian police force, and he had always been interested in the way the prisoners had looked at him just before he executed them. He could see the same thing right here. The Greek had accepted death. All hope had gone. "I took a considerable risk coming here," Kirst spoke with a heavy mid-European accent, which somehow dragged his words down. "What is it you want?"
"I would have thought the answer would be obvious to you."
"The Elgin marbles."
"Exactly. I wanted you to come here so that you would understand."
Ariston reached out with a hand that was more like a claw, gripping a lever on one wheel of his chair. The whole thing was battery-operated, and with a soft whir, it spun him round so that he faced the room.
"This is one of the greatest pieces of art that the world has ever produced," he began. "Take a look at the figures, Mr. Kirst. They are so beautiful that it is almost impossible to find the words to describe them. They once decorated a temple in the heart of Athens, the Parthenon, dedicated to Athena, the goddess of wisdom. The frieze which you are examining depicts the summer festival that took place every year in honor of the goddess."
Again the claw pressed down, turning him so that he faced a group of statues which stood behind him. First there was a horse, rising as if out of water, with only its head showing. Then came a naked man, lying on his back. Then 3 women, all missing their heads. From the way they were arranged, it was clear that these figures had once stood in one of the pediments at each end of the Parthenon.
"The horse belonged to Helios, the sun god," Ariston explained. "Next comes Dionysius, the god of wine. The figures to his left are the goddess Demeter and her daughter."
"I am familiar with the Elgin marbles," Kirst interrupted. It didn't matter how much he had been paid. He hadn't come here for a lecture.
"Then you will also be aware that they were plundered, stolen. 200 years ago, a British aristocrat called Lord Elgin came to Athens. He tore them off the temple and transported them back to London. Since then, my country has asked many times for them to be returned. We have even built a new museum in Athens to house them. They are the glory of Greece, Mr. Kirst. They are part of our heritage. They should come home."
The old man fumbled in the folds of his blanket and produced an oxygen mask which he pressed against his face. There was the hiss of compressed air, and he sucked greedily. At last he continued.
"But the British government have refused. They insist on keeping this stolen property. They will not listen to the voice of the Greek people, and so I have decided that although it will be the last thing I do in my life, I will make them listen. That is why I have contacted you and your organization. I want you to steal the sculptures and return them to Greece."
In the street outside, 4 more cars had pulled up next to the British Museum, spilling out 15 more agents. With the ones who had followed Kirst from City Airport, that brought the total to 23. They were fairly confident that their man was still inside the building, but with 76 galleries covering a floor space of 1/5 of a square mile, it was going to be almost impossible to find him. And already the order had gone out. "Do not under any circumstances approach him while he is in a public area. This man is extremely dangerous. If he feels trapped, there's no saying what he will do. The result could be a bloodbath." Zeljan Kirst was quite unaware of the approaching MI6 men, as he considered what the Greek billionaire had just said. "Stealing the Elgin marbles won't help you," he said. "The British government will simply demand them back. It would be better to threaten them. Blackmail them, perhaps."
"Do whatever it takes. I don't care. You can kill half the population of this loathsome country if it will achieve what I want."
Ariston broke into a fit of coughing. Pearls of white saliva appeared at the corners of his mouth. Kirst waited for him to recover. Then he nodded slowly. "It can be done," he said, "but it will take time. And it will be expensive." Ariston nodded.
"This work will be my legacy to the Greek people. If you agree to do it for me, I will pay you 5 million euros immediately, and a further 15 million when you succeed."
"It's not enough," Kirst said. Ariston looked at him slyly.
There was a time when you might have said that, and I would have been forced to agree. But Scorpia is not what it was. There have been 2 failures in the space of a single year. The operation called Invisible Sword, and more recently the business in northwest Australia.
He smiled, showing grey teeth.
The very fact that you are here today shows how weak you have become.
Scorpia has regrouped, Kirst retorted. We have taken on new recruits. I would say we are stronger than ever. We can choose our clients, Mr. Xenopoulos, and we do not negotiate.
Name your price.
40 million.
Ariston's eyes barely flickered.
Agreed.
Half in advance.
As you wish.
Kirst turned and walked away without saying another word, his cane beating the same rhythm on the floor. As he made his way back towards the entrance, his mind was already focused on the task that lay ahead. Although he would never have dreamed of saying as much, he was glad he had come here today. It was very much his desire to take on the British government once again. The failures Ariston had mentioned had both involved the British Secret Service. It was fortunate that the old man hadn't heard the full story. Would he have still approached Scorpia if he had known the almost incredible truth? That both failures had involved the same 14-year-old boy. In the end, it was just bad luck, bad timing, that Kirst left the gallery when he did. He was about to reach the great court when one of the MI6 agents crossed in front of him, and suddenly the 2 of them were face to face, only inches apart. The agent, his name was Parker, was new and inexperienced. He was unable to keep the shock out of his eyes, and at that moment Kirst knew he had been recognized. Parker had no choice. He had been given his orders, but he knew that if he obeyed them, he would die. He fumbled in his jacket and pulled out his pistol, a 9mm Browning, long a favourite of the SAS. At the same time, he shouted louder than he needed to,
"Stay where you are! If you move, I'll fire!"
It was exactly how he had been trained. He was both exerting his authority over his target and alerting any nearby agents that his cover had been blown. In the silence of the museum, and with the ceiling so high overhead, his words echoed out. A few tourists turned to see what was happening, and caught sight of the gun. The first seeds of panic were planted, and instantly began to grow. Kirst raised his hands, one of them still holding the ebony walking stick, and moved very slightly to one side. Parker followed him with his eyes, and didn't see something flash through the air over Kirst's shoulder, didn't even notice it, until it had buried itself in his throat. The old woman who had been painting a copy of the kneeling goddess had followed Kirst to the door. Underneath the makeup, she wasn't old at all, and her brushes might have had tufts at one end, but the handles were precision-made steel and razor-sharp. Parker fell to his knees. In the last second of his life, his trigger finger tightened and the gun went off, the explosion amplified by the stone walls all around. That was when the panic began for real. The tourists screamed and scattered, some of them diving into the shops or behind the information desks. A group of primary school children who had been visiting the Egyptian mummies crouched down beside the stairs, cowering together. An American woman standing next to them began to scream. The British Museum guards, many of them old and long retired from their real careers, remained frozen to the spot, completely unprepared for an event like this. Kirst stepped over the dead man and continued to move slowly towards the main door. Of course, he hadn't come to the museum alone. Scorpia would not have risked the life of its chief executive even for €1 million, and its agents surrounded him on all sides. As the MI6 men closed in from every direction, still unsure what had happened, but knowing that all the rules had changed, they were met by a hail of machine-gun fire. The bearded student who had been examining the postcards had reached into his backpack and drawn out a miniature machine gun with folding shoulder stock, and was spraying the court with bullets. An MI6 man halfway down the west stairs threw his arms back in surprise, then jerked forward and tumbled down. The American woman was still screaming. The primary school children were crying in terror. All the alarms in the building had gone off. People were running in every direction. The Japanese man who had been photographing his wife threw his camera on the floor, and it exploded with a soft whoomph, releasing thick, dark green fumes into the air. In seconds, Kirst had disappeared. The great court had become a battle zone. 2 MI6 agents slid to a halt, trying to peer through the smoke. There was a loud crack, then another, and they fell to the ground. They had been shot in the legs by the Japanese woman who had produced a pearl-handled Nambu pistol from her handbag. Meanwhile, holding a handkerchief across his face, Kirst had reached the main doors. There had been little security when he came in. There was none as he left. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw an MI6 agent try to rush him, then fall back as he was grabbed by his personal bodyguard, the black man with the notebook whom he had registered on his way to the Elgin Marbles. The human neck makes an unmistakable sound when it is snapped, and he heard it now. The agent slumped to the ground. Kirst walked out into the fresh air. There were people running between the pillars, tumbling down the steps and hurling themselves across the open area in front of the museum. Already the police were on their way, their sirens growing in volume as they came together from different parts of the city. Kirst's limousine was waiting for him at the gates, but there were 2 men moving purposefully towards him, both dressed in charcoal-grey suits and sunglasses. He briefly wondered why people who worked in espionage had to make themselves look so obvious. They had become aware of the chaos inside the British Museum and were racing in. Perhaps they hadn't expected him to emerge so quickly. Kirst lifted his walking stick. It was, in fact, a hollowed-out tube with a single gas-fired bullet and an electric trigger concealed just beneath the handle. The bullet had been specially modified. It wouldn't just kill a man. It would tear him in half. He fired. The man on the left was blown off his feet, landing in a spinning, bloody ball. The second man froze for just 1 second. It was much too long. Moving surprisingly fast for someone of his age, Kirst swung the walking stick through the air, using it like a sword. The metal casing slammed into the agent's throat, and he crumpled. Kirst ran for the car. The back door was already open, and he threw himself in, slamming it behind him. There was a series of gunshots, but the car windows were bulletproof, and the bodywork was armour-plated. With a screech of tyres, the limousine swung out. Another man stood in the way, his gun held commando-style in both hands. The chauffeur accelerated. There was a thud as the man hit the bumper, and he was hurled out of the way. 2 hours later, a man in a blonde wig, wearing sunglasses and holding a huge bunch of flowers, boarded the Eurostar train to Paris. Zeljan Kirst hated these disguises, but it was something else he had learned in his long career. If you're trying not to be seen, it often helps to make yourself as prominent as possible. The flowers and the wig were ridiculous, but although the police and MI6 were looking for him all over London, they certainly wouldn't associate them with him. As he settled into his pre-booked seat in first class and sipped his complimentary glass of champagne, Kirst's mind was focused on the problem he had been given. The shootout at the museum was already forgotten. The question was, who would be the best person to handle this quite interesting business of the Elgin Marbles? There were now 12 members of Scorpia, including him, and he mentally went over them one by one. Levi Kroll, the former Israeli agent who, in a moment of carelessness, had shot out his own eye. Mikato, the Japanese policeman turned Yakuza gangster. Dr. 3. Or perhaps this might be an opportunity for their newest recruit. He had the sort of mind that would enjoy working out a problem of this complexity, along with the ruthlessness to see it through to the end. There was a blast of a whistle, and the train moved off. Kirst took out his mobile phone, encrypted, of course, and dialed a number. The train slid down the platform and picked up speed, and as they left St. Pancras International, Kirst permitted himself the rare luxury of a smile. Yes, Razim was perfect. He would bring his unique talents to this new assignment. Kirst was sure of it. He had chosen exactly the right man. The Measurement of Pain.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, my dear Mr. Kirst. I will begin to consider the matter at once.
The man was standing on the parapet of a French fort built at the end of the 18th century when Napoleon had invaded Egypt. A few new buildings had been added more recently, and there were signs of further construction: scaffolding, lifting equipment, and a great pile of salt which had been drawn from a nearby lake to be mixed with sand to make bricks. There was something very strange about the compound, which stood on its own, perfectly square, surrounded by sand. It looked like a scene out of a Hollywood film, or perhaps a mirage. First there was the outer wall, not high but several metres thick, with battlements all the way round, and solid guard towers rising up much further at each of the four corners. These were punctuated by narrow, slot-like windows, making it easy to look out but impossible to look in. The only way into the fort was through an arched gateway with two huge gates made of whole tree trunks bound with steel. It would have taken several men to open them if they hadn't been electrically operated. Inside, the fort was like an army barracks, with a dozen buildings neatly laid out around a central well. Water, of course, was everything in the desert. An army would be able to survive here for months, living, sleeping, exercising, and drilling on the parade ground, hardly aware of the world outside. There were two accommodation blocks, one for officers, one for common soldiers, a prison block, various storerooms, an old bakehouse, and a chapel. All of these had been converted, with air conditioning, hot and cold running water, every modern comfort. The old stables had been turned into a recreation room, with snooker tables and a cinema screen. The armoury still contained weapons, though very different from the ones used by the forces of Napoleon. These now included flamethrowers, hand grenades, and even handheld rocket launchers, for the man who had privately purchased the fort and redesigned it needed to be safe, and beneath the sun-baked bricks, the dusty courtyard, and the ancient battlements lay some very sophisticated equipment indeed. Everything was powered by an electric generator, housed in what had once been the forge. A radio mast and 3 satellite dishes rose above one of the towers. Television cameras watched for any movement. At night, infrared lights and radar scanned the area all around. These were wired up to the control room, once the bakehouse. A single chimney rose above its flat roof, leading up from what had been the bread oven. The control room was manned 24 hours a day, and nobody could enter or leave the fort without authorization. The main gates could only be opened from inside. It was in constant radio communication with the guards on patrol. These were local men, dressed in Bedouin style, headdresses, loose-fitting robes and sandals, with knives at their belts. They also had machine guns slung over their shoulders. The man's name was Abdulaziz al-Razim, but that wasn't what he called himself now. As an internationally wanted terrorist and convicted war criminal, it was better not to have any name at all. To his friends in Scorpia he was known simply as Razim, and in truth he had no other friends. He was unmarried. Sometimes he would spend a whole month without speaking to anyone at all. But Razim didn't mind. In fact, he preferred it that way. Razim was not an Egyptian. He had been born 45 years ago in the town of Tikrit in Iraq. His father was a university professor. His mother had studied Arabic literature at Cambridge University and had herself become a well-known writer and poet. Abdulaziz, the name means servant of the powerful in Arabic, was one of 2 children. He had an elder sister called Rima. The family had lived together in one of the oldest houses of the town, a narrow white brick building constructed around a central courtyard, packed with flowers and plants, and with a fountain playing in the middle. From the very start, Razim was a difficult child. His father used to joke that he had been born in a sandstorm, and that some of the sand must have got into his blood. As a baby he never smiled or gurgled, but lay sullenly in his cot, as if wondering how he had got there, and how perhaps he might escape. As soon as he had learned to walk, he tried to run away. Nannies never stayed long in the household. Razim's temper tantrums drove 3 of them away. The 4th left with a pair of nail scissors driven into her thigh after she had told him off for teasing his sister. At least he did well at school. Indeed, his teachers thought he was a genius. He came top in every subject, and by the age of 12 was fluent in 3 languages. It was hardly surprising that he didn't get on with the other children. Even then, Razim had no friends. He was a quiet, solitary boy, and he had already come to realize that there was something different about him, although he wasn't quite sure what it was. Eventually, he managed to work it out. He felt no emotions. Nothing scared or upset him. Nothing made him particularly happy either. There was no food that he particularly enjoyed. It was as if the whole of life had been put under a laboratory slide, and he was the scientist examining it. Every day for him was the same. He didn't feel anything. He decided to put this to the test. His parents had bought him a pet, a scruffy mongrel, when he was small, and it had always been his companion. So one day he took it down to the orchard behind their house and strangled it, just to see how he felt. It didn't bother him at all. His mother and father wondered about the missing dog, and they also noticed the scratches on Razim's hands and arms, but they accepted his explanation that he had brushed against a barbed wire fence. They were both intelligent people, but no parent wants to think the worst of their child, and the truth was that Razim was still doing brilliantly at school. He ate his meals with them and came with them to the mosque for prayers. He clearly didn't like his sister, but he was polite to her. What more could they ask? In 1979, the history of Iraq changed when Saddam Hussein came to power. One of his first acts as president was to arrest 68 members of his party and accuse them of treason. 22 of these were executed. The other 46 were forced to make up the firing squads. When Razim heard about this little twist of cruelty, he realized that his country had been taken over by a man who was very close to his own heart. He began to think how he might get to meet him. Could he find a way into the corridors of power? As it happened, the opportunity arose very quickly. It was obvious to many people in Iraq that Saddam was brutal, mad, and dangerous, and in the late summer of that same year, Razim's parents held a secret meeting in their house with other academics, writers, and well-placed friends to discuss how they might get rid of him. How were they to know that Razim was recording the entire conversation on a digital recorder that they had given him for his 14th birthday? The next day, he skipped school and went instead to the local police, taking the evidence with him. Revenge came like a desert storm. Razim's parents were arrested and shot without even the benefit of a trial. Razim never found out what happened to his 17-year-old sister, but nor did he care. The last he saw of her, she was being dragged screaming from the house by 4 laughing policemen, who threw her into the back of a van. Everyone who had attended the meeting was arrested. None of them were ever seen again. As a reward for his loyalty, the local chief of police invited Razim, now an orphan, to see him in his office above the jail near the Farouk Palace. Sitting behind his desk, with his belly rising above it, the police chief examined the boy sitting opposite him. He did not like what he saw. Razim was small for his age and very slender, more like a girl than a boy. His hair was neatly cut in a fringe, and he was wearing his school uniform. But what troubled him was the boy's complete lack of expression. He had the face of a waxwork, eyes that could have been made of glass. There was no warmth or curiosity. There was nothing at all. Even so, he tried to be polite.
"You have been of great service to your country," he began. "Your parents and their friends were traitors. You were right to do what you did."
The boy didn't respond.
"What would you like to happen to you now?"
"I thought I might join the police," Razim said. "I'm sure you have lots of people you have to kill. I'd like to help." The police chief had children of his own, and this boy, whose feet barely reached the floor, sickened him.
"You're too young to join the police,"
he said. "I don't want to go back to school. It's boring."
"I think it would be better if you left Tikrit."
For a brief moment the police chief was tempted to take out his gun and shoot the child. He would have felt exactly the same had he found himself faced with a scorpion or a poisonous snake. He had to hold on to his hand to prevent it from dropping down to the holster at his belt.
"We will arrange for you to be fostered," he said, "somewhere far away."
"Don't I get a reward?"
"It will come to you, in time."
In the end, Razim was sent to live with a wealthy family, distant relatives of the president in Baghdad. The family despised him at first sight, but knew better than to ask any questions. And from this moment on, he began to thrive. He continued to excel at school and, at 17, became the youngest student to enter the College of Engineering at Amir Abad campus, part of the University of Tehran. By now he had changed his mind about his future. He would use his scientific skills to become a weapons designer. It was well known that Saddam Hussein was developing biological and chemical weapons. Razim himself had a keen interest in small arms. In his first term at university, he won a commendation for a 20-page essay on the Yugoslavian Zastava M70, the assault rifle which, he was told, had been used to kill his parents. His dream was that he might one day invent a new weapon, which he would name after himself. It wasn't going to happen. On Razim's 18th birthday, he received a letter printed on official government paper. It turned out that someone high up hadn't forgotten the teenager who had once betrayed his entire family. Razim was to leave university immediately. He was being invited, and it wasn't an invitation that anyone could refuse, to join the Mukhabarat. He was to report to their offices the next day. The Mukhabarat, Iraq's dreaded secret intelligence service. Razim read the letter with a faint twinge of something that might actually have been pleasure. He had heard the horror stories about the organization and knew that it was work to which he was ideally suited. He packed immediately and left at 6 the next morning. Nobody at the university even noticed he had gone. For the next 20 years, Razim discovered the pleasure of being feared. Actually, it was more than that. Anyone who met him knew that he had absolute power over their life or death, and that with one snap of his fingers they might never be seen again. If he were to point to a picture or a valuable vase in a man's house, the object would be waiting at the door for him to take with him when he left. The same was true for the man's wife or children. Razim boasted that he had so many enemies he could have bathed daily in their blood. The rumour in Baghdad was that he did. His power increased. Soon he had a house the size of a palace, filled with servants who fell silent and looked away when he came into the room. He had barely grown at all. He was still the same size and shape as a schoolboy, although his hair had turned silver at a very early age, making him look both very old and very young at the same time. He wore glasses that were a little too large for his face, and one of his officers had once joked that he looked like a Middle Eastern Harry Potter. Razim had enjoyed the joke. He was almost smiling as he stabbed the officer 9 times with a paper knife. And then came the Iraq War of 2003, and the invasion by the American and British forces. Unlike so many of Saddam's inner circle, Razim could see which way the wind was blowing, and made plans to save himself. The night before the bombing of Baghdad, he slipped out of the country in the private 8-seater Beechjet 400 that belonged to one of the president's younger half-brothers, flying over the border into Saudi Arabia. He took with him all the treasures he could carry, works of art, diamonds, gold coins, and international bonds. All of these would be easier to trade than cash. He settled in Riyadh and waited for the war to end, which it did, as he'd expected, very quickly. It was clear to him that he couldn't return to Iraq, not while it was being occupied by the British and American forces, but using the connections he had made while he was with the Mukhabarat, he contacted the local recruiting officer for Al-Qaeda, and soon found himself in charge of his own extensive terrorist cell. He wasn't paid, of course, but then he didn't need to be. He was a wealthy man. Nor was he interested in religion or politics. For him, terrorism was like a jigsaw puzzle. You have an embassy and a bomb. How do you fit one into the other to create the most unforgettable picture? It was a challenge which stimulated his mind, and he helped plan more than a dozen attacks in Europe and America, carefully examining the results on the 55-inch plasma screen he had installed in his luxurious house. This successful period in his life came to an end when his commanding officer suggested that, to show his devotion to the Islamic cause, he might like to become a suicide bomber himself. Razim was given a belt filled with high explosive and shown how to wrap it round his stomach and set it off with a single button on his mobile phone. He would be smuggled into Pakistan and dropped off at a central market. From there, it would be a short step to paradise. Razim thought about all this for a few minutes, and then used the explosive to blow up his commanding officer. It was time to move again. By now the British and Americans were on his trail. Saddam had been hanged, his sons had been shot. Razim had no doubt that one or other of these fates would be waiting for him if he was ever caught, unless Al-Qaeda found him first. It really was quite annoying to have so many enemies. He would just have to find another city where he could start his life again. He chose Cairo. With a population of 7 million crammed into 83 square miles, he would be completely invisible. He briefly considered plastic surgery. There were plenty of clinics in the back streets of West Zamalek, a high-rise area of the city close to the Nile, and if you paid enough, nobody would ask any questions. But in fact, very few people knew what he looked like. He had taken great care that this should be the case, always covering his head with a traditional gutra, or Arab scarf. Even when he was in Western clothes, he had worn sunglasses and a baseball cap pulled down low. He decided that surgery would not be needed. He lived quietly, making sure he didn't attract any attention. And he waited for the next opportunity to reveal itself, as he was sure it would. He still owned a penthouse in the middle of Cairo and a summer house in the Red Sea resort of Sharm el-Sheikh. But his favourite home was where he was now, this long-forgotten fort lost in more than 1 million square miles of sand. This was where he came to escape from the crowds. It was where he felt secure, and it was a perfect setting, too, for the series of experiments in which he was now engaged. There was a rope bridge that crossed from one side of the fort to the other. Razim had ordered it to be installed to save him walking all the way round. He used it now, putting out both hands to steady himself as it swayed beneath his feet. The salt pile was right beneath him, and he watched as one of the guards emptied a wheelbarrow, adding to the heap. Razim had insisted that the new building should be done in the traditional Berber style, mixing salt with sand. It was slow, but it felt right. Everything was quiet. The desert had settled for the night. He reached the other end of the bridge and walked along the opposite parapet until he came to a stone staircase, which led back down to ground level. He took it. A second guard stood respectfully to attention as he passed by. Razim still didn't know how Scorpia had managed to track him down. At first it had worried him. If they could find him, then any one of the world's intelligence agencies might follow. But he had soon realized that Scorpia was an organization like no other. After all, by and large, the police and security services do not threaten murder or violence to get the information they want. And in the end he was glad that they had decided to seek him out. They were offering exactly the sort of work that interested him, along with the promise of enormous sums of money. The two of them really were made for each other. Take this new assignment, the first he would handle as project leader. It was already a fascinating challenge. How to return the Elgin marbles to Greece. Like Zeljan Kirst, Razim had already dismissed the idea of stealing them, although that would surely have been easy enough. When was the last time anyone had checked security at the British Museum? Many of the roofs were made of glass, and the security staff, low-paid and lazy, could be either bribed or replaced. But that wouldn't work. If the marbles were ever to be seen in public again, then they would have to be returned legally with the full cooperation of the British government. So what it came down to was a question of leverage. How could Scorpia persuade them to do something that they had always refused to do before? He took out a packet of cigarettes and lit one. He smoked Black Devils, manufactured in China, and sold by the long-established firm of Hoypink and Blumen in the Netherlands. He had the packets specially modified, so they no longer warned him that he would quite probably die of cancer. Razim didn't really care when he died, or how, but he didn't like being bossed around by governments. He sucked in, letting the sweet, slightly vanilla taste of the tobacco roll over his tongue. Small clouds of dust rose around his feet as he crossed the courtyard. The beam of a spotlight swept the ground just ahead. Still smoking, he went into a circular building with a domed roof and a tower. This had once been a chapel. Razim had found faded pictures of various saints on some of the walls, and there had even been a stained-glass window, the only glass in the entire place. Perhaps French soldiers had come here once to pray that they would soon be sent home. Razim had smashed the window and painted over the frescoes. They were of no interest to him. He had, of course, never believed in God. The interior was brightly lit. and kept at a pleasant temperature by a sophisticated air conditioning system. The walls were now all white and specially thick to keep out the heat. There were machines everywhere. Computers, television monitors, different-sized boxes with dials and gauges. In the middle of all this, trapped in a pool of brilliant light, a man sat in a leather dentist's chair, tied to it by soft cords around his ankles and wrists. He was wearing only boxer shorts. Dozens of wires had been attached to him, to his head, his chest, his pulse, his abdomen, held in place by sticky tape. By a happy coincidence, the man was French. He was about 30 years old, and he was trying not to look afraid. He was failing. Razim knew his name. It was Luc Fontaine, and he worked for the GGSE, the French intelligence agency dealing in external security. The man was, in other words, a secret agent, a spy. Razim had always known that foreign investigators would come looking for him, and he therefore kept a careful watch for them. This one had got closer than many. He had been picked up asking questions in the Central Market, or souk, knocked out and then brought here. He was still pretending to be a tourist, but only half-heartedly. By now he knew that he was in the hands of a man who did not make mistakes. There was a trolley draped with a white cloth next to the dentist's chair. Razim wheeled it round and uncovered it to reveal a series of knives lined up in neat rows. Each one a different shape and size, gleaming in the harsh light. There were other instruments, too. Swabs and silver bowls, hypodermic syringes, vials containing liquids that were colourless but somehow didn't look like water. Fontaine saw this. He tried not to show any emotion, but his naked skin crawled. Razim pulled up a stool and sat down. He drew on the cigarette. The tip glowed.
"What do you want?"
Fontaine asked. He spoke in French. His voice was hoarse. Razim didn't answer.
"I'm not going to tell you anything."
The secret agent had dropped the pretense that he was a tourist. He knew there was no longer any point in it.
"And I am not going to ask you anything,"
Razim replied. His French was excellent. It was one of the languages he had learned at school.
"You have no information that I wish to know."
"Then why am I here?"
The young man flexed his arms, the muscles bulging, but the cords held fast.
"I will tell you."
Razim tapped ash into one of the bowls.
"I have been many things in my life," he said. "But when I set out, I was an engineer. That is how I was trained. Science, in its many varieties, has always been an interest of mine. And you should be glad that you are here with me tonight, Luc. Do you mind if I call you Luc? I am pursuing a project that will be of great benefit to the world, and fate has chosen you to help me."
"My people know I'm here."
"Nobody knows you are here. Even you do not know where you are. Please try not to interrupt."
Razim put out his cigarette. He licked his lips.
"It occurred to me some years ago that everything in this world is measured, and that many of these measurements have been named after the great engineers. The most obvious example is the watt, which measures electricity, and which was named after James Watt, the inventor of the modern steam engine. Joule and Newton were both physicists and have been immortalized in the measurement of energy, joules and newtons. Every day we measure the atmospheric heat in either Fahrenheit or Celsius. The first is named after a German physicist, the second a Swedish astronomer. We measure distance and height and speed and brightness. If you wish to buy anything from a shoe to a sheet of paper, you ask for it by size. There are measuring units that many people have never heard of. Can you tell me what a pyron is, or a palmo, or a petaflop? But here is the strange thing. There has never been a measurement for something we experience almost every day of our lives. There has never been a measurement for pain. Can you imagine how useful it would be if you went to the dentist and he was able to reassure you, "Don't worry, my dear fellow, this is only going to hurt 2.5 units. Or if you went to the doctor with a damaged knee and were able to tell him that it hurt 3 units down here but 7.5 units up here, above the knee. Of course, it is very difficult to measure pain. It all depends on how our nerves react.
and what the stimulus is. Knife, electricity, fire, acid, that has caused the pain. But I still believe it is possible to develop a universal scale, and I very much hope that one day the unit of pain will be named after me, the razim, and people will be able to say exactly how many razims will result in certain death. Fontaine was staring at Razim as if seeing him for the first time. "You're mad," he whispered. "All great inventors have a certain madness," Razim agreed. "They said the same of Galileo and Einstein. It is what I would expect you to say." "Please." "I would also expect you to beg, but I'm afraid it will do you no good." Razim leaned over the trolley and considered. It would be interesting to see how long this Frenchman survived. Of course, for the sake of accuracy, he would have to experiment on women, and if one ever came his way, a teenager would be useful too. Everybody reacts to pain in different ways, and he needed to examine the full spectrum. He made his decision and chose an instrument. Moments later, the needles on the various monitors leapt forward as the first screams rang out into the night. Fly by Night. The tourist boat was moored at the Quai de Grenelle on the western edge of the city. But the people who stepped on board that bright afternoon in June most definitely were not tourists. It had been Max Grendel, the oldest founding member of Scorpia, who had decided that they should have a floating office in Paris. This had been one of the last decisions he had made, as he died a few months later, stung to death by scorpions in a gondola in Venice. The bateau mouche, literally fly boat, looked like any other pleasure craft gliding up and down the river. It was long and narrow, with a flat bottom and a low canopy made almost entirely of glass to give its passengers the best possible views. Inside, however, it was very different. Instead of rows of seating for 200 or 300 sightseers, there was a single conference table and 12 chairs. A soundproof wall separated this area from the cabin where the captain and the first mate stood at the controls. The rest of the crew, 4 men in their 20s, stayed outside on the deck. They were not allowed to look into the cabin. They stood as still as the statues that lined the bridges, their eyes fixed on both banks of the river, searching for any movement that might be construed as enemy action. Grendel's idea wasn't quite as odd as it might seem. Unlike a building, a boat would be impossible to bug, particularly as it was kept under 24-hour guard and thoroughly swept before every meeting. Also, unlike a building, it could move, so anyone trying to eavesdrop on what was being said would have to move too, at equal speed. And as the ship was fitted with a Ruston 12RK diesel engine stolen from a Royal Navy River-class offshore patrol vessel, that might be very fast indeed. Finally, should a police launch attempt to come close, there was a point defence weapon system based on the famous goalkeeper technology developed by the Dutch, with autocannon and advanced radar concealed beneath false panels on the foredeck. This was capable of firing 70 rounds per second at a distance of up to 1,500 metres. If necessary, Scorpia was both willing and able to start a small war in the heart of Paris. The boat was called Le Débiteur, which might be translated as someone who leaves without paying their debts. Such people used to be called fly-by-nights. As Grendel had argued, there was something very calming about discussing business while cruising past some of the most beautiful buildings in Europe, particularly when the business was as dangerous as theirs. Sabotage, corruption, intelligence, and assassination. These were the 4 activities that had given Scorpia its name. It was here in Paris that it had been formed, a collection of intelligence agents from around the world who had seen that their services might no longer be needed after the end of the Cold War, and who had decided to go into business for themselves. It had been a wise move. Secret agents are generally not highly paid. The head of MI5 in England receives only £200,000 a year, a tiny amount compared with any investment banker. Every member of Scorpia had multiplied his annual income by a factor of 10, and none of them paid any tax. There were once again 12 of them, and they were now all men. There had been a woman on the original executive board, but she had been killed in London. Altogether, 6 of the founding members had died, 1 from natural causes. The current chief executive was Zeljan Kirst, sitting at one end of the table in a charcoal grey suit, white shirt and black tie. As he had explained to Ariston in London, Scorpia had recently taken on 6 new recruits, although it had been forced to look outside the intelligence community for some of them. There was a ginger-haired Irishman who called himself Seamus and had been a member of the IRA. Twin brothers had been brought in from the Italian mafia. And finally, there was Razim. Scorpia was on the way up. That was the message it wanted to make clear to the world. It was taking back the control it should never have lost. The 12 executives arrived individually and at 5-minute intervals, some in chauffeured cars, some on foot, one even on a bicycle. Only Giovanni and Eduardo Grimaldi, the twins, arrived together, but then in 25 years they had never spent a minute apart. At exactly 3 o'clock, the deckhands lifted the anchor. The captain pushed forward on the throttle, and Le Débiteur slipped out into the river, beginning its journey east towards the Eiffel Tower and Notre Dame. Zeljan Kirst waited until they were on their way before he spoke. He didn't greet anyone by name. Such matters were a waste of words. Nor did he offer anyone a drink, not even a glass of water. None of these people trusted each other, so they would only have refused it. If he had any recollection of his narrow escape in London, he didn't show it. His eyes were heavy. He looked almost bored.
"Good day to you, gentlemen,"
he began. As usual, the English language sounded peculiarly ugly coming from his lips, but it had long since been agreed that English was the only language they would speak.
"We have come together today to agree upon our tactics for an operation which we have called Horseman, and which will earn us the sum of 40 million euros when it is successfully completed. As you all know, I have given the management of this business to Mr. Razim."
Kirst glanced sideways. As he had expected, there was a brief flash of anger in the single eye of the Israeli agent Levi Kroll. This was the 3rd time he had been passed over for Project Command. Nobody else had noticed. Their attention was fixed on the man with the silver hair and the round spectacles who had been placed, not by accident, at the head of the table.
"I will add only that the first installment of the money has been paid into our Cayman Islands account by our client Ariston Xenopoulos,"
Kirst continued.
"We will receive the full amount on the same day that the so-called Elgin marbles land on Greek soil."
"How is Ariston?"
Dr. 3 asked. He was very small, and as the years went by he seemed to be getting smaller. He had recently completed a 2,000-page encyclopedia on the subject of torture. The writing had exhausted him, although he had enjoyed the research.
"He is critically ill,"
Kirst replied.
"According to his doctors, he should already be dead."
"And if he dies before our work is complete?"
"The money will still be paid."
Kirst blinked heavily as if to cut off any further discussion.
"But it is not just a question of money for us,"
he went on.
"This is a matter of great importance. We have endured 2 failures in a single year, unheard of in our long history. And I have heard unpleasant whispers, gentlemen. There are some governments and intelligence agencies that no longer trust us with their assignments. The purchase of nuclear material for Iran, a terrorist atrocity in Tel Aviv, the collapse of the banking system in Singapore. Just 3 recent operations which should have come to us, but which instead were given to other organizations. We have to prove to our clients that we are back to our full strength, and this is our opportunity. The work we begin here today will have echoes that will be heard throughout the world."
He nodded in the direction of Razim.
"Please, tell the board what you have planned."
"With great pleasure, Mr. Kirst." Razim licked his lips. Pleasure was not a word he used often. It was not an emotion that was familiar to him, and yet he had been looking forward to this moment for a long time, and he felt something close to a thrill to be the one holding the reins, to be in command of the entire executive board of Scorpia.
"The Elgin marbles,"
he muttered, his voice barely audible above the drone of the motor. "The British government has refused, time and again, to hand them back. Why? Because they are selfish and arrogant. And the question I have been asking myself for the last few months is, what will make them overcome their selfishness and arrogance? What will make them change their mind? And the answer I have come up with is a single word: fear. Somehow we have to arrange matters so that they have no choice. We have to put them in a position where they must return the sculptures, where their survival depends on it. But at the same time, it has to be done very delicately. For example, we could steal a nuclear device and threaten to set it off in the heart of London if they did not comply with our wishes. But this would not be easy, and it might not even work. They might not believe us. They might, as it were, call our bluff. And it is not our task to turn the British into victims, no matter how pleasant the thought. It will suit our purposes more if they are hated. They are thieves and aggressors. They deserve the condemnation of every civilized country." Razim drew a breath. 21 eyes in the room were all turned on him. Outside, the boat was cutting through the bright water, heading towards a bend in the river, with the Eiffel Tower and the Field of Mars looming up on the right. They passed underneath a bridge, the Pont d'Iéna, and a bar of shadow swept briefly across the glass ceiling.
"I do not believe violence or the threat of violence is the answer,"
Razim went on.
"But suppose we were to arrange a trap for them. Imagine that we were to arrange a scandal so dark and so shocking that it would destroy their reputation for decades to come. No country would do business with them. The Americans would turn their back on them. The European community already hates them, but this would be the final straw. Nobody would trust them. Suddenly, Great Britain would be a very small and lonely island indeed. Imagine all that, my friends, and ask yourselves what the British government would do to avoid it. Do you think, perhaps, they would agree to empty one room in a stupid museum in the middle of London? Would they cheerfully send a collection of old statues back to their rightful owners? I think they would. I really think they would."
Razim longed for a cigarette. He could feel the packet pressing inside his jacket pocket. Today he was wearing European dress, but he dared not reach for it. It wasn't that smoking was forbidden. It was just that it might be considered a weakness.
"I have already put into operation a plan that will achieve all this," he said. "It is the sort of exercise that carries the unmistakable stamp and authority of Scorpia, and from what I have been told, I think it will give everyone around this table a great deal of personal satisfaction, because, gentlemen, what I have in mind involves a teenage boy."
He paused for effect.
"The boy's name is Alex Rider."
There was a moment of perfect silence. Even the engine seemed to have stopped. The last 2 words seemed to have had a paralyzing effect on at least half the people in the cabin.
"Alex Rider?"
Sitting next to Kroll, the Japanese man called Mikato raised a thumb to his lips and bit at the nail. As he did so, he exposed the diamond set in one of his front teeth. Mikato was a member of the criminal organization known as the Yakuza, and had tattooed the names of every man he had killed across his body. Unfortunately, he had run out of space.
"We have encountered this boy twice," he began. "We even tried to kill him with a bullet fired into his heart. The sniper we hired had never failed." "Please, hear me out," Razim interrupted. "I have given the matter a great deal of thought." Suddenly he decided, to hell with it. He took out his packet of Black Devils and lit one with a solid gold lighter. Smoke curled in front of his face, reflected in the 2 circles of his glasses. "I am perfectly aware that Alex Rider has, incredibly, got the better of this organization on 2 occasions," he said. "There was a fairly simple affair involving the creation of a tsunami to strike the coast of Australia, and before that, the late Mrs. Rothman was responsible for the operation called Invisible Sword. This was a secret weapon using nanoshells with a cyanide core. The plan was to poison thousands of children in Britain. We do not need to discuss these matters." There was a Frenchman at the table.
a man with a neat grey beard and the long, slender fingers of a pianist. He was rolling his knuckles across the wooden surface, a sign of his irritation.
"But we do need to discuss them, Monsieur Duval," Razim replied. "How can we understand our one weakness if we don't examine it?"
He waved a hand.
"There is absolutely nothing special about this child, except that he is a child. That is the only reason he has been so useful to MI6. Oh yes, he received some training from his uncle, who was a spy himself before he was killed. But do you really think a basic knowledge of karate and the ability to speak a few foreign languages were the reasons he managed to defeat you? That's nonsense. Alex Ryder won because you underestimated him. Winston Yu should have shot him when he had the chance, and Mrs. Rothman too. Maybe they hesitated because he was so young, but that was his strength. He was the world's most unlikely spy. It didn't matter if it was the island of Skeleton Key or Sale Enterprises in Cornwall. Nobody looked at him twice. That was their mistake.
"And our mistake," Kroll began. He had been listening to all this in growing discomfort. He alone was allowing his emotions to get the better of him. Zeljan Kirst had noticed this. It was what he had expected.
"Let me finish," Razim cut him off. "I have done a great deal of research into this child. I managed to obtain a copy of a report prepared by a journalist last year, and it confirmed what I had already found out for myself. On at least 6 occasions, it may be more, he was employed by the Special Operations Division of MI6. Gentlemen, I ask you to consider the implications. Everyone at this table knows only too well that secret agents, spies, aren't really heroes. The work they do is often dirty and unpleasant. They kill people who have to be killed, and they do it without a second thought. They have no pity and no sense of shame. They share the sorts of secrets that nobody else wants to know. Do spies have friends? Of course not. Nobody in their right mind would want to get close to them. They cannot be trusted. So what would happen if it was discovered that MI6 had recruited a 14-year-old schoolboy? Too young to vote, too young to smoke or get married, but old enough to be sent to foreign countries, to get mixed up in international politics, terrorism and murder. What would that say about that country's government, or its secret service? And let us take it one step further. Suppose the boy was sent on a mission that went horribly wrong, but this time it wasn't something brave or clever. He wasn't trying to save the world from some madman like Damien Gray. He wasn't protecting British children from a lethal virus hidden inside a computer. No. This time, he was involved in something that the entire world would condemn.
As Razim spoke, some of the men around the table were becoming more alert, nodding as they followed the thread of what he was saying.
And let us also imagine that during the course of this mission, the boy was killed.
This brought smiles and a few murmurs of approval.
Suddenly we have a situation. A 14-year-old is shot to death by police in the streets of a major city. There are documents in his pockets. Perhaps he is carrying a gun that can be traced back to London. All the evidence proves beyond any doubt that he was working for MI6. Think for a minute what the result of all this would be.
"It would be covered up," Mikato said. "There isn't a newspaper that would dare print such a story."
Quite possibly. But we would have all the evidence. Scorpia would have collected emails, phone intercepts, photographs, voice recordings. We would have in our hands a bomb that we could detonate at any time. And the result? The reputation of the British government would be destroyed. It would be